Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox and Matt Kelly back again with another episode of the award winning Compliance in the Weeds. Matt, welcome back.
Hello, Tom. Good to be here.
Matt, I'm coming to you today from the Fairmont Hotel in Austin, Texas, in preparation for Trust Week. So, welcome from Austin,
It's good to be here. I'm coming to you from my house.
the world headquarters of the renowned cutting edge radical compliance.
Indeed.
Matt, you've written a couple of posts over the last week or so on third party risk management. It started with a report from Prevalent, which I think we both found incredibly interesting. But you expanded on that a little bit with a report from Microsoft. So you want to maybe walk us through the two reports and what you saw, and then we could take a deep dive into them.
Sure. So, I'll start with the Prevalent report. So, Prevalent is a purveyor of third party risk management software. For the record, I do not do any paid work with Prevalent, and they didn't know I was writing about this study. But they put out a study about how companies are trying to approach risk management. They polled 156, I think it was, large companies and asked them about their third party risk management programs. And what I found interesting was that number one, a lot of different business functions within the large enterprise are touching third-party risk management, which unto itself is not news, but each of these independent functions is thinking about third-party risk management in different ways. And so you have different priorities. For example, procurement, much more interested in onboarding new vendors, but IT security is much more interested in the security of these vendors and so forth and so on. So that's where these highly siloed approaches, that's where it comes from. And we can get into that a bit later. But then the other big finding from the Prevalent study was that for all of this third-party risk management going on, most companies still use spreadsheets as their primary mechanism to manage third-party risk. Well, if you've got manual processes and a rather siloed approach to governing third-party risk, that's going to leave opportunity for a lot of cracks in the enterprise and cracks in your program. So leading then almost inevitably, I think, to the third big conclusion from the Prevalent study, which was that a lot of companies aren't managing all of their third parties. They found that only on average, companies are managing about 1/3 of their third parties. The average was around, I think, 3,200 third parties in total that you have. And how many are you actually managing? A little more than 1,000. So we have a large number of third parties that are just going unaddressed. And is that because they don't have the right tools to do it? Is that because companies don't have the right sort of structure because everybody's poking at third-party risk in different ways? So there's a lot there on that Prevalent study, full stop. But you're right that by coincidence, a couple of days later, Microsoft released its annual sustainability report. Fascinating. But they essentially admitted that as good as Microsoft is as a company governing its own carbon emissions, almost all of its total carbon emissions come from its supply chain. And its supply chain carbon emissions are still going up, which means as good as Microsoft is with its own house, its total emissions are going up. And that is a long-winded way of saying that, really, Microsoft will never achieve its sustainability objectives unless it governs its supply chain well. And that, I think, is reflective of most companies. Most companies are going to find themselves in a similar predicament where hitting any sustainability disclosure targets you have or sustainability goals you have, that's not a sustainability challenge. That is a supply chain management challenge, which brings us back to Prevalent and third-party risk, because isn't third-party risk and supply chain almost completely overlapping? So how are you managing your supply chain? How are you handling all of the silos that might be involved there? What are the processes that are involved in it? These are two very different reports, but they both point to the complexity of third-party management challenges these days. And I think that a lot of companies still struggle with it.
So, Matt, about 5 or 6 years ago, I interviewed someone from Deloitte whose name, unfortunately, I have forgotten. But he, at that time, said every company needs to have an EVP of third party risk management. And he was the only person I had heard say that. And reading your blog post and listening to your recitation there of that first blog post on the Prevalent report reminded me that that problem is that there's no visibility by one person or even a group of the board of directors across all of these. And maybe there does need to be some higher level position that can at least have visibility and oversight. That's sort of point number one.
Mm-hmm.
Point number two is the numbers. And I think in your report, you cited a number of around 3,000 average, of around 1,000 was being managed. When I had to do third-party risk management, particularly on the vendor side, you had multiples of 5x, 10x, sometimes 20x over what was being looked at from the compliance perspective over in the supply chain. And you had to figure out a way quickly to risk rank those in a manner that allowed you to have oversight, because you simply can't oversee 3,000 different companies or 5,000 different companies, or maybe even 1,000. So there's got to be some type of risk ranking, but it has to be, I think I got from your post, across all of those silos. Do any of those points resonate?
Well, they do. I'll start with your executive vice president of third parties concept, which I have heard before. And in fact, I also have heard from Deloitte and other of the big four audit and consulting firms talk about this. You know, the ones who I've spoken with have said that this is really more of a chief risk officer post for non-financial companies. Chief risk officers in banks, as usual, means something totally different, putting the banks over there on the side. But for most businesses, you know, you have to think through, how are you going to understand these risks? And if I could split some hairs here, I think the question is, are you, the company, are you going to manage your third parties and all of the risks that they bring along? Or are you going to manage the risks that arise from your third parties? And there is a distinction there, that if you are tackling third parties overall, you could think through, what sort of single dedicated function do we want to have that manages all of our third parties? And then that gets to, is this an EVP of third party risk or chief risk officer, whoever it is? But it's a person, it's a function, it's a role. And they look at third parties holistically. On the other hand, if the company is just managing the risks that arise from third parties, that's how we slide into these siloed approaches. So, for example, IT security is mostly going to be thinking, well, I'm in charge of IT security risks, so that's what I'm going to look at for these third parties. I don't really care that they might also be a sanctions risk or their sustainability metrics are terrible. I just need to know that they're not a security risk. Compliance officers, likewise, might say, I'm really only concerned about whether this third party is a corruption risk. It's not my job to worry about, are they overcharging us on price, or are they such an invaluable supplier that if they go bankrupt, we're all screwed for the quarter. That's somebody else's problem. But that's how you get these siloed approaches, when in fact, any one of those risks could pose a dire threat. Tom, I do think that getting to your second point about you can't manage them all, it points to one of the fundamental challenges here, is that for a lot of these risks, it doesn't really matter if the risk is from a second or a third party. Here's what I mean. Let's go back to the IT security people. So you can't manage all of the risks for all 20,000 third parties you have. Well, actually, if you're an IT security person, yeah, you do. That's the job. Because if you have an online payment system, then any single one of them could be cybersecurity risks, including the ones who water the ficus plants, and they bill you $200 a month. But if they're in your online payment system, you have to think that through. How am I going to prevent a cybersecurity attack from coming up through my payment system, which is a time-honored way of hackers blowing up your company, is they sneak in through the payment system or the invoicing system or something like that. the hackers and the risk won't make the distinction. Is this coming from a third party? Is it coming from internally? Like, the risk is the risk, and how am I going to tackle it? That sounds like a big convoluted thing, but that gets to my point, is that the IT security team isn't that invested in, is this a second party risk, a third party risk? Is it internal? It's a security risk. Doesn't matter where it comes from. I have to prevent it. So there are a lot of struggles here. Like, I don't have a good answer for that scenario I just posed. But, do you need to worry about corruption risk for all 20,000 third parties you have? Probably not. I don't think the FICA swattering plant company is really going to be bribing foreign government officials. So you can work some broad categories and risk ranking there, but you can't do it with all third party risks. Some of them must inherently be managed all the way down to the last one. So that gets us to this problem here that we have. And this is why third party risks are so convoluted. Are you worrying about the risks, or are you worrying about third parties and all of the risks they bring? It is an important distinction, as mind numbing as it might sound when you actually say it out loud.
So, Matt, in your blog post on the Prevalent report, you had a couple of charts that you cited to that apparently came from the Prevalent report. And I wanted to take up the first one, which was entitled with the question, what are the primary objectives for these departments in your third-party risk program efforts? And you have several departments: information security, data privacy, procurement, risk management, compliance, audit. Then you've got two business owners and executives. Could you really, or rather, speak to what you saw or see as the primary objectives of the business owners and or the executives in the third-party risk management arena?
Well, like, honestly, I don't know that they care that much, because if you're the business or the executive, like, you're not that interested in, is this vendor secure? Is it onboarded quickly? Is it a corruption risk or not? You're just interested in, can they help me solve my business problem? And they are, I'm going to guess, say that somebody else in the enterprise worries about whether this third party is acceptable from a risk standpoint. I'm thinking of it more from an operations standpoint. Me, the CEO, me, the head of sales or research and development, or facilities management or whatever. They're just thinking, can I get this job done? And can I get it done with a third party? Third party knows how to do the job. That's great. Never will they stop to think, what about this third party's carbon emissions? What about its forced labor? What about its IT security practices? What about its fraud risk? What about its potential for sanctions or anything like that? Senior management in the business simply want to know that the third party risks have been managed and handled, so I can sit back from my lofty chair in the executive suite and think more big thoughts about how I can use third parties to achieve my strategic business objectives. And that's it. And I'm sure that the board would like briefings from time to time that all of the risks within our plans for third parties have been managed to the appropriate extent. But that's really all they want. But all the others that are on the Prevalent chart there, they do point to that fact that different functions have different priorities and objectives. So they're not wrong to have those priorities and objectives, but how do you balance multiple objectives and priorities from multiple business teams thinking about third parties when you have to get your arms around all of it? Which brings us back to, do you have a vice president of third party management? Do you have a chief risk officer? To whom does that person report? To whom can that person deliver bad news and say, no, we're not going to use this third party? That's the big struggle that on the org chart that a lot of companies, I think, still have not yet resolved.
And now I'd like to turn to the second chart, which shows that spreadsheets seem to be at or close to 50% of the recording mechanism for assessing your third parties. Now, our colleague Jonathan Armstrong has publicly declared that spreadsheets are evil. I'm not sure I saw you go quite that far, but could you tell us the problems with still using spreadsheets in June or May 2024?
Oh, good Lord. Well, I can tell you that probably until January of 2025, because they do have plenty of very serious problems. You might have inaccurate data that gets recorded because you're recording it manually, and somebody types in a 2 instead of a 1, or somebody types in a different name. They type in J Smith instead of John Smith, and then suddenly the computer thinks that J Smith and John Smith are different people. You could lose version control. You could lose the whole spreadsheet and just forget that it's on that shared drive, or that it's on Fred's hard drive, and Fred quit last week and he took the laptop home with him. There's questions about version control, access control, accuracy of these data that you're collecting, the reliability of the data. You might not be looking at the most current format. In full disclosure, before we got on here, I was editing a Word document, which is just written a spreadsheet, but it's still just a desktop tool. And I spent an hour editing the wrong thing when one of my business partners said, "Oh, we actually have a different version." So I had to go back and redo the whole thing. Like, this happens all the time. However, while spreadsheets may be evil, they are also easy to use. Everybody has them. They're on every desktop computer in the country. You can just fire them up. Everybody has the basics on how you can use a spreadsheet. So they are a seductive alternative to get some things done, because you can fuss with them exactly how you want rather than following some sort of dedicated process or procedure, which is what a GRC tool would force employees to do, because those tools would account for and control all of the risks I mentioned about 60 seconds ago. So I don't know how we get rid of this. I mean, it's the IT equivalent of just mange. Everybody can get it if they're not careful, and then you wind up having to take care of it all the time. But spreadsheets, it seems like they will always be with us, regardless of how maddening they can be from a control perspective.
Matt, could we spend a little bit of time on your second blog post, which is entitled "Sustainability Risk is a Supply Chain Risk"? And I was really intrigued by your line that that's mostly a data collection issue. Is it a data collection issue, or is it data collection, data management, and something else?
So it's a little bit of both. And let me unpack things here so we can get to that data collection question the right way. So yes, Microsoft published its sustainability report. Very cool, very thorough, very thought-provoking, and kudos to Microsoft for trying to do its good work as a corporate citizen. But that work included some fascinating statistics that more than 95% of all of Microsoft's carbon emissions come from its supply chain, either upstream, the stuff Microsoft needs to put out the products that it does, or downstream, the carbon emissions generated by people using Microsoft products. So I think they said it was 96 point some odd percent comes from its supply chain. That means 4% or less of Microsoft's total carbon emissions come from the actual business. That's really easy to control, and Microsoft has done so. Its carbon emissions from Scope 1 itself and Scope 2, the electricity it uses, those carbon emissions are actually down last year from where they were in 2020. But because the supply chain emissions have gone up by such a large amount, I think it was 30%, Microsoft's total carbon emissions have gone up from 2020. Even though it's pushing its own downward, its supply chain use and its reliance have gone up by such a large amount that it just lifted the whole thing back up. So Microsoft is implementing a new requirement for its 100 largest suppliers that by 2030, those 100 largest suppliers must have zero emissions on their electricity use, I think it is, for their Microsoft products. But Microsoft is going to basically force its suppliers to be carbon neutral by the end of the decade. Sounds good. I don't mind that goal. I too would like the climate and the planet to be better off. But how are you actually going to do that? That is a supply chain management problem. So that's where I was going with this Microsoft post. Sustainability goals, achieving them for most companies is really going to be a supply chain management task. So does your sustainability function get to decide that about the supply chain? Do they get a seat at the table when the rest of the enterprise is thinking about the supply chain? Do they get some opportunity to say no to key suppliers because their sustainability is terrible? To be clear, Microsoft has also said that it is, quote, not there yet on getting rid of suppliers that can't meet its sustainability goals. I guess that means they'll be getting there by 2030 or so. But is the sustainability function going to be able to wield that sort of power over the supply chain? And then you get back to, Tom, what you had talked about before. How would you do that if that's the route you're going to do, exercise control over the supply chain? How are you going to do that well? Part of it will be data collection, because you will need to be able to extract that information from your suppliers somehow. That might be a contract management issue that you're going to have to impose that requirement on them. You might get that carbon emissions data from a third source, so you can cross-check it all and make sure what your suppliers are telling you is tracking with what others have said about the supplier's carbon emissions. So there's going to be a big part of it is a data collection issue, but a big part of it is going to be the personnel and policy and the roles and authority that are involved here. And gets back to, would you, the sustainability officer, be able to dictate the supply chain strategies for the company to be able to fulfill sustainability targets? I'm going to guess for a lot of companies that's no, because we all would like to be green, but are we really going to take a hit to profits because we can't find green suppliers? Who's going to make that choice? The CFO or the sustainability officer, the CEO, somebody else? I don't think a lot of companies have had that come to Jesus moment yet where they figure that out. I think a lot of them are frankly stalling for time, and we're going to try and hit net zero targets by 2030 or 2035. Eventually, that tension will come to the fore. Eventually, you will need to change your supply chain operations and your business operations to hit sustainability targets. And if that requires a hit to financial performance, who makes that decision? And who gets to decide who that person is? I don't know that we've got that answer yet, but those are the questions in front of a lot of large companies.
I guess that does not worry me as much for the following reason, Matt. I saw the same discussion around supply chain and anti-bribery, anti-corruption compliance in the first decade of this year in the energy space. And corporations, largely in energy, because of the FCPA sweep through energy, made the conscious decision that this was a risk that would not be tolerated. And so vendors were evaluated on their compliance programs. And if it was a significant enough vendor, 50,000, 100,000, whatever it may have been in spend, they either put together a compliance program, had it audited, or they were no longer on the vendor approved list. And companies actually went to the vendors and audited these programs and put the time, effort, and money into looking at them. It was very labor intensive, very resource intensive, but that was the decision from on high. And once that tone was set, it was concluded or it was completed. So I believe that can be done now if you simply substitute sustainability for anti-bribery, anti-corruption, change it from maybe a risk to an issue, whatever you want to call it. It can be done, but it takes the top management to say, yes, sustainability will be either the number one criteria or 1A. And if you don't meet these goals, sorry, we're going to drop you as a vendor. So once again, I've seen that model work before.
Well, here's where I would challenge that, or where I wonder if that approach might break down, is what are the incentives for top management to go down that route? Well, what are the consequences if we don't? Let's take FCPA. If consequences were, if you said, law be damned, I don't care, we're just going to keep on working with corrupt partners, you're going to face stiff enforcement. You're going to face potentially shareholder litigation. You're going to face potentially declines in market share. And those are pressures that would make top management say, okay, I guess maybe we should take anti-bribery seriously. We do not yet have those forces in place for sustainability. And here's my thought experiment for it. Let's say 2030 comes around and Microsoft has not made its sustainability targets. Does anybody think Microsoft's market cap is going to suffer because of that? Does anybody think Microsoft is going to face swift and severe enforcement from regulators? Because under Republican administrations, I'm still not even convinced that they know or think that global warming is real. And there are some states that are trying to make it illegal to even for companies to think about global warming and set sustainability targets. So if there isn't an incentive for management to think about it, if there isn't something that tells management, here are the consequences for not doing this, and they are severe, then management's not necessarily going to have the same incentives. They do have those pressures for anti-corruption, and that's a good thing. I would like to see them have the same pressures and incentives for sustainability, but I don't yet know that they are there. And I can easily see various scenarios where they're never going to be there. A lot of Republicans are going to wind up trying to repeal sustainability enforcement or discussion issues. And then if those are gone, how many managers are really going to think about it a whole lot, especially to the point where they'll sacrifice financial goals, sacrifice compensation that they might get in order to satisfy sustainability goals that really nobody's going to care and nothing's going to happen if you don't meet them. That's my concern. That's where I think these comparisons might not line up.
Well, I think there are other areas where corporations make the determination we're going to do something that we're not required to do legally, and that could be in having a better culture, a non-toxic culture or something. But I do see your point that there are a different set of incentives. But if Microsoft's management decides this is important to us, that is incentive enough within Microsoft, regardless of whether the federal government says something one way or the other.
We will just have to wait and see how it all evolves over the next 5 or 10 years, I guess.
Well, Matt, that seems like a good point to end this podcast. Great blog post as usual, and I look forward to continuing this conversation.
Thank you, Tom.